Well, hello, I'm Josh, and I'm back once again with another great film to tell you about. And today I have a really gripping thriller that is currently celebrating its 50th anniversary this year. That being Francis Ford Coppola's 1974 classic, The Conversation. The Conversation follows Harry Call, an expert wiretapper who has been given the task of recording a conversation between a man and a woman in a noisy, crowded park, a job thought to be almost impossible to do. But Call manages to pull a clean recording out of it and is surprised to find the dialogue to be eerily vague and foreboding.
Kill us if you got the chance.
Still haunted by a past job which ended in murder, Call begins to fear for the couple's safety and decides to investigate the real meaning of this conversation for himself. So as I said, this film was directed by Francis Ford Coppola in 1974, which happened to be an exceptionally good year for him, as he also made The Godfather Part 2 in that very same year, meaning that two of his films ended up competing with each other for the Oscars. But despite being very well received, The Godfather Part 2 was of course the much more commercial of the two, and outside of film fans, I rarely hear anyone talk much about The Conversation, despite its gripping story and quite realistic look at the world of surveillance. Something which feels almost more relevant than ever with today's Ring cameras, webcams, GPS trackers, and cell phones. In fact, much of the wiretapping equipment used in the film also happened to be the same models that were used by the Nixon administration, which later came out during the Watergate scandal. And though the film had already been shot by the time these details were made public, it ended up becoming very fitting for this classic conspiracy thriller. And this genre of conspiracy thrillers was really on the rise when this movie came out, with films like The Manchurian Candidate and 7 Days in May being made the decade before by John Frankenheimer. And then Alan J. Pakula had just released The Parallax View earlier that year in 1974, before he would go on to make All the President's Men 2 years later. And though The Conversation is much less political than some of those, and really more of a character study, the twisty story combined with paranoid soundtrack and visuals really cements this as one of the best. Coppola first got the inspiration for this film after seeing Michelangelo Antonioni's classic Blow Up, which is about a photographer who thinks he's caught an assassination in the background of a photograph he took. This gave Coppola the idea to move the concept into the world of wiretapping and audio surveillance. And if that film Blow Up sounds familiar, it was also the inspiration for another conspiracy thriller made a few years later by director Brian De Palma called Blow Out, which, though also involving a sound recordist investigating a murder, it ends up being a very different film from The Conversation, though also quite good. And one of the benefits of the film being made when it was is, as opposed to today's technology with sound mixing and video editing being entirely accomplished on an LCD screen and keyboard, seeing the actual tape being hand-wound into spools on an editing station and Hackman manipulate the sounds with physical knobs and buttons just feels so much more cinematic than doing it with a few clicks of a mouse, really allowing for more compelling visuals than you might expect for a film that's essentially about listening to sound recordings. And on top of that, it's just really cool to see what this state-of-the-art equipment looked like in those days. I also really like just how dreamy the film feels, and you may not get that from the visuals I'm showing as it was shot in a very gritty and grounded style, but the incredible music score and sound design just gives the film this almost otherworldly feel at times. And David Shire's score is fantastic. The theme is this beautifully hypnotic piano tune that really gets stuck in your head, but the further Call gets into uncovering the mystery, the piano music starts to drift and become distorted. And as the visuals, though still shot in a grounded style, become more bold and even frightening, the music is what really gives these scenes the feeling of a nightmare. The editing and sound design on the film was done by the great Walter Murch, who literally wrote the book on editing and had practically revolutionized sound design in movies only the year before on George Lucas's American Graffiti, and was one of the first people to really solidify sound design as its own discipline. So it should be no surprise how incredible this film sounds. I mean, there was really nothing else to compare it to back in those days, and considering all these sounds and alterations had to be done by hand on tape just makes it all the more impressive. And one of the things I found to be most surprising on my first watch of this film was just the cast. I mean, it seemed like I recognized just about everybody from something, whether it be classic TV or major movies. For a small film like this, the cast really covers it all. I mean, the main star is of course Gene Hackman, who is just perfect in this, and is surprisingly very subdued here compared to other films people would have probably known him from at the time, most notably The French Connection. Whereas here, he is very quiet and antisocial, generally preferring to be at home playing his saxophone. And as we see throughout the film, a large part of that seems to be due to his vast knowledge of surveillance, and ultimately his fears of being spied on himself. And The Conversation is also notable for being one of the few films John Cazale was in. And though he only appeared in 5 films before his death, those films were Dog Day Afternoon, The Godfather Parts 1 and 2, The Deer Hunter, and this film. So, as you can see, he had about as perfect of a filmography as you can get. And Teri Garr is also great in this, despite having a relatively small part. And kind of like John Cazale, she also had a knack for appearing in tons of classics. I mean, just to name a few, you have Young Frankenstein, Tootsie, and a film I've talked about, Close Encounters of the Third Kind. And you can also see Alan Garfield, who, along with this film, is probably best known as the police chief in Beverly Hills Cop 2. But he's here as Bernie Moran, a competing wiretapper who tends to get on Call's nerves as they clearly have a long history together. Frederic Forrest, a frequent collaborator with Francis Ford Coppola, probably most famously in Apocalypse Now, can be also seen here as Mark, one of the people Hackman has secretly recorded. And along with him, Cindy Williams, who most people would know from TV shows like Happy Days and Laverne and Shirley, is also here. And another primarily TV actress seen here is Elizabeth MacRae as Meredith, who classic TV fans will likely recognize as Gomer Pyle's girlfriend Luann Poovey. And you also have Robert Duvall, who is of course also great in a very brief appearance as the kind of shady director who initially gives Call the job. He was of course probably best known for being in The Godfather at this point, so it's pretty cool to see Coppola use him here, albeit briefly. And in the most unexpected bit of casting, Harrison Ford is here as the director's assistant, Martin Stett. It honestly feels a bit like seeing Jack Nicholson in those old Roger Corman films, and even the Andy Griffith Show, where they obviously didn't know what a major star he would become, and so they end up having him play these odd little characters that are so far off from the roles that he is known for today. The year before, Ford had appeared in a small role in American Graffiti along with Cindy Williams, and a few years later, he appeared in another Coppola film, Apocalypse Now, in a similarly small role. And he does a great job in all of them and is surprisingly menacing in this film, but knowing the massive star he would become, it's just always interesting to see him in these early Coppola films. So if you'd like to watch The Conversation, it's available from all the usual places as a rent or buy option online. And physically, you can get it on DVD or Blu-ray like I have here, and recently a very fancy 4K box set of this film also came out, so I'm sure a cheaper version is also on the way if you're interested. But now for my comment question, I'm wondering, what is the best sound design you've heard in a movie? It's not normally something you think of, as really if it's doing its job well, you shouldn't be noticing it too much, but a film soundtrack can really bring an audience into a story much more than people realize. So what's a film that stood out to you as having a really creative or immersive sound? I mean, there are so many creative things people have done with the medium, so put your favorites in the comment section below and start discussing. Hit the like button if you enjoyed this video, and subscribe if you want to see some more of these. Remember to keep watching movies, and I will see you again soon.